Hi, everybody.
Hello.
How are people doing this morning? Yeah, we got one really good woo in there.
Yeah,
Still need coffee.
he didn't sleep. He's still going.
All right, welcome to, I believe it's called Jonathan Ying Presents Asymmetric Games.
Yep.
I did not decide on this title.
No pressure.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm Jonathan Ying, and I'm here with a crew of lovely designers and editors and people who have done a lot of work on asymmetric games. It's a pretty broad topic because asymmetry has a bit of a variety of meanings. But first, before we dive right into that, let's have everyone introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they like about asymmetric games or an asymmetric game or idea, Tim, that got you into that you enjoy. Let's start at that.
Yeah.
Let's
Okay.
go.
Tim Fowers, independent game designer, publisher, and I made Paperback, Burgle Bros, and Fugitive. And inspiration for me, I was gonna say Voltron. Voltron is kind of the ultimate like asymmetrical. You know, it just as a kid it just blew my mind that they all come together and but they all still had their own colors and powers and uniqueness, but
Some
still kind
form
of
a leg, some don't.
Yeah, it was great.
Hi, my name is Joshua Yearsley. I was a developer on Roots, and I'm also a developer on Vast and Mysterious Manor. So what inspired me to get into asymmetric games, or the first one that really wowed me, was definitely Chaos in the Old World. Really the experience of, the exploratory experience of being like, okay, wait. Okay, so everyone, this is actually how we're supposed to defeat this faction because it works in a completely different way from everyone else. How do you actually beat Korn in that game? As a first-time player, you're like, I don't know. But over the course of playing that game, you know, go through the layers, get to deeper layers, and it's really just an experience that blossoms. And so that's really what inspired me to love asymmetric games.
I'm Nikki Valens. I designed a whole bunch of Lovecraftian games, Mansions of Madness and Arkham Horror 3rd Edition, and also Legacy of Dragonholt, which is not Lovecraft. For my asymmetrical inspirations, the first time I really encountered anything asymmetrical was in Guild Wars, the first one, and I really liked that all of the different classes had like different resource systems that allowed them to use their abilities, and I thought that was so cool to just have a completely different system of how you wanted to play the game as each different class.
Yeah. And hi again, I'm Jonathan Ying. I think for me, one of the most interesting experiences I had early on in my gaming career was honestly Dungeons and Dragons, where you have these dramatically different roles of these players are, you know, the heroes, and one player is God, or at the very least, you know, has a substantially greater amount of power and control over the game and has a responsibility to make that game more interesting and exciting for the other players involved. And that kind of, you know, that spread of responsibility even within the party itself of like, you know, you have the tank and the healer and those kinds of things, or just the player who can keep everyone together. Those ideas really resonated with me and made me really excited to work on 1v versus many games like Star Wars Imperial Assault or Doom, the board game 2016, which I've worked on. I did not work on the 2011 version, which interestingly, 2011 Doom is only differentiated from 2016 Doom on Board Game Geek by a space between the word board and game. There's Doom the board game and Doom the board game. Anyway.
Shame on them.
Right. So, as we might have hinted at, there are actually multiple types of asymmetry in games. You can broadly divide them into soft asymmetry and hard asymmetry. Soft asymmetry is something like asymmetry of ability or asymmetry of character role. So, like a game that had, like, say, Dota or World of Warcraft, where you're all generally playing with the same fundamental systems, you know, health, damage, etc., but you are participating in a slightly different way. But overall, your goals are the same. You know, everything else is the same. There's asymmetry of objective, where you are playing with a similar playstyle, but you're looking at a different target, the way I believe Root does.
Oh yeah. I mean,
quite thoroughly.
Everyone loves victory points in that game, but you're all scoring in very, very, very different ways. So.
Yep. So like, yeah, the way you progress to your victory condition can be very asymmetrical. And then there's things like full asymmetry of mechanics, like one versus many games, where it's like the Imperial player in Star Wars Imperial Assault is playing a tactical strategy game with a whole bunch of units and spawning more units all the time, whereas each of the heroes are basically playing an RPG, right? Like you've got a single character with a suite of abilities, and you're coordinating with your teammates, and that creates just a completely different game experience for the players. So asymmetrical games are pretty challenging, and there's a whole lot that goes into them. So do we want to go around and talk about, like, what are the advantages of making an asymmetrical game? Like, why do you want to put all these different systems and things into the game? What value does that bring?
So for me, I care very much about narrative and tying narrative to mechanics. So this plays into Root a lot as well, but being able to approach different factions who have very different methodologies, very different ideas of like how they care about things, and being able to tie the mechanics and their theme together in such a way that they feel very different, very distinct as factions, purely on the theme, but then also on the mechanics. You can see both of them tied together, and they play very differently, they feel very different, and they look very different. And that's such a huge advantage to be able to sell the idea of different philosophies and different perspectives within a game.
Must be fun then with Mansions of Madness. You're selling these narratives with the different roles, so it's suited that the great old ones are sort of in this app in your hands.
Oh man,
the
we'll talk about Mansions.
unknowable app.
Yeah.
And we love seeing this narrative play out in Root. So many people, after they've played it, said, wait, okay, so the Vagabond, you're just literally playing a role-playing game. You're playing a little hero bopping around the forest while everybody else is fighting. And it would be so much harder to actually get that sort of experience if it was a more symmetric game. So.
I think the reason to make asymmetric games is is around the core of competition. I think that there's a lot of research around this where in games where it's not only direct conflict domination, but it's also deterministic, that you got beat by that person. There's a part of our brain that actually goes into it's like an alpha beta thing in a pack. Like when you're beat in that way, they found that their testosterone level drops. They don't want to interact with that game or that player again. And so I found asymmetry as a way out of this kind of direct conflict scenario. It was probably the most intentional with Fugitive, where it's like doing this, okay, I'm the predator, you're the prey, and then we're going to switch and you'll chase. That kind of back and forth still feels tense, but when you lose in that scenario, you don't feel that same I'm just a worse person. It's like, oh, well, you were doing something different than me.
Oh yeah, like if I lose a game of like chess or Go, I'm just like, wow, I suck. It feels very direct because, I suppose we should give an example of symmetric games. Are games where, but all of the participants have almost entirely the same set of mechanics that they're playing with, like Go or chess. But even those games are very slightly asymmetric with things like first player advantage, right? But the more asymmetric. So it's a spectrum, really.
And you can now blame your loss on the asymmetry.
Right.
It's actually really healthy to have a scapegoat emotionally for why you lost.
It's funny to talk about that. A lot of the work that I do as a developer is trying to make the play experience as smooth as possible, and so I'm always looking out for gotcha moments. And asymmetric games, unfortunately, you have to make because everyone is playing by different rules, it's much easier to accidentally design in a lot of gotcha moments for the first time when you're playing the game. And so it does provide both that, as long as you have a well-designed asymmetric game, it does provide that the mental release valve for that. But it also, when you're making an asymmetric game, the more complex that game gets, the more opportunities that you have to accidentally have those oh, I just didn't understand that thing at all. That doesn't feel really good in the moment. And so that's something that you always have to be on the lookout for in asymmetric games, is because people can't actually fully understand on the first play. If you have a complex asymmetric game like Roots, there is absolutely no way and it is inadvisable to try to teach everybody's rules as you begin playing.
That is a great transition into our segue into what are the disadvantages
Yep.
of making asymmetric games, which I think you just covered a really good one. I find in a lot of asymmetric design, you get this cool advantage that players get to learn a different game when they want to come back to it, right? Like, you just finished playing a game of like Netrunner or like XCOM as a particular role, and you finish that and you're like, oh, now I want to try the scientist, or now I want to try, this other faction in this game. It really extends the game's lifespan, but you can also run into the risk as like, I've had some challenges teaching Vast to some people because everyone's mechanics are so different. Right. And it's super cool and everyone's really excited, but like once you learn your mechanic, right, you're still parsing your own system and you're like, oh, this interacts so deeply with everyone else.
Yeah, and we're really folding in a lot of those lessons. So coming from Root into Vast, we really wanted to make an effort to build a little bit stronger foundation for like, okay, here's some fundamental concepts that even though these are building blocks that apply to each faction in very different ways, you're moving, you're battling, you're crafting.
Yeah, softening the asymmetry.
Exactly, softening it slightly. So rather than having asymmetry in lots and lots and lots of tiny little parts, basically coalescing things into a little like little nugget of goodness that everybody can understand and share, but interacts with in very different ways. So it's all about that interface between that chunk of rules and the way that everyone's interacting with it.
Tim?
Well, I think that even if you think about an asymmetric game as an auction, and a problem with auction games is valuation. Like the first time in, I don't know how valuable this thing is. And so one of the big disadvantages is that I come into this game and I'm fighting for this resource and the other factions like don't care about that resource, and I'm like, oh, I guess I'll have it all. Like you feel like you overbid for things in an asymmetric game, and it takes that apples versus oranges comparison to really understand what to fight for.
Yep. Yeah, one game that does this interestingly is the Coin series. It's by GMT Games, and in Coin, everybody has like 2 separate victory conditions that they need to fulfill to actually win, and all of the factions are half overlapping in the victory conditions that they care about. So everyone has like one thing that only they care about, and everyone has one thing that some other faction cares about. So it's this interesting way of combating sort of that auction thing with this partial overlap and partial thing you only care about yourself.
Oh, you were talking about coming back to the game and having a new game to learn essentially with a different role, which for many players is such a great thing. I love to do that. That's one of the reasons I'm super interested in Root, even though it's not typically a type of game that I would want to play, but like I want to keep going back and playing every single faction so I can learn what they're all about and see how they interact. But that's definitely not something that's for everyone. So there's certainly players that once they've learned the game, they're like, cool, now I can play this game. And if they have to learn the game again the next time they come back, like you might lose those players. They don't want to have to keep, maybe they stick to like the only one faction and they're not getting the same thing out of that game as other players might be getting.
Oh man, yeah. So losing players when they come back is a big challenge, particularly in games with like one versus many games, right? Which are aggressively asymmetrical to the point where it is possible for 5 players to come down to sit at a table, and the 2 outcomes are one of them wins or 4 of them win. And so at the end of the game, it's like, oh, 4 people had they're like, yeah, we did it, or 4 people are like, oh, damn it. And we actually worked on balancing a lot of games like Imperial Assault. We want to make the first missions feel like we don't want them to feel oppressive for one side, for the Overlord side, the single player side, because they're usually the player who brings the game out, who like kind of has learned the rules most carefully and so has the most investment, and they need to get the other players involved. So the early missions are usually a little easier, a little simpler, a little more understandable, because if you bring your friends over to be like, hey, let's play Imperial Assault, I'll be the Imperial player, and you just beat the tar out of them, they don't want to play with you again.
No, that's like your friend that would invite you over to play their Super Nintendo and then destroy you at that game, just to show their skill.
And then Imperial Assault is like, so we're going to do this 12 more times, right, guys? And it's just, like, you got to build for that.
Yeah. Well, in that vein, talking about asymmetrical games is balancing new players versus experienced players. And I found this very much in Fugitive and now in Sabotage is, for new players, what's the win percentages for these different factions? And then for experienced players, what are the win percentages? And I found that like my games kind of tilted like 60-40, like it was easier to be the fugitive early, and then once you got the deduction down and you understand it,
So
it tilts the other way.
Fugitive, for those who don't know, is a deduction game where one player plays a thief and the other player plays a marshal trying to hunt them down.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very tight, very lightweight game that was reviewed by Shut Up and Sit Down, I believe.
Yeah, yes.
And Sabotage.
And Sabotage is the same. It's guards versus spies. It's a lot of my games are kind of cat and mouse asymmetry is kind of the way I explain it. But balancing it is tough. Like how much affordance do you give the new player at expense of the experienced player, and vice versa? Because a lot of these asymmetries can just lean so hard, because a lot of times you don't have like a catch-up mechanic for them. And if they just don't understand how to fight this totally other force, it's like those alien movies where like we don't even know what hurts the aliens, and then it was like the cold that killed them or whatever. It's like, that's how you feel in an asymmetric game at the beginning. You're just like you're punching at something that doesn't matter, and that can be frustrating. And so making that onboarding smooth is really tricky. And then still having a late game that is balanced between all these experienced players.
Yeah. In Root, one thing that I was noticing was that early in the development process, we were noticing lots of mismatches between the players coming to the table and the sorts of factions that were actually going to fit with them. So like when we had mixes of experienced players or newer players, or even just different players' play styles. So it's really important to create expectations in asymmetric games. And so once that was the point where we started putting a lot of information about the factions on the backs of their boards to kind of give you just this basic idea of, okay, this faction is more aggressive than this faction. This faction is more complex than this faction. So creating those expectations allows players to kind of self-sort in ways that make sense to make that asymmetry a little less harsh when you're first getting players to the table and first trying to feel out the game.
Yeah, games with heavy multiplayer like Root or like Cosmic Encounter are also very, very good at balancing the asymmetry, because even if one faction is really particularly strong, particularly in like Cosmic, where it's like, oh, this alien's power is that they can't die, or this alien's power is that their strength grows exponentially. Like they get crazy strong, and everyone's like, oh god, they're so powerful. Those factions tend to not win because everyone gangs up on them. Everyone like kind of, sees that threat, identifies it, and then works to self-correct, which is, some players think that's great, some players don't. But that is the way Cosmic Encounter balances having grossly different asymmetrical power levels, which is not common in games. Most games, even when you have asymmetrical roles, you try and keep their power levels fairly consistent. Cosmic doesn't, and has still managed to be incredibly successful.
I think a shout out for Magic here, as like the 5 colors of Magic have these radically different play styles, and it's shown everybody how asymmetry can work in kind of even 1v1.
I think Magic, one of my favorite descriptors of Magic, really, and one of the biggest advantages of it, is that it is a game where both players in a game feel like they're engaged in a boss fight, right? Like with completely different mechanics, but both of them feel like, oh god, what are they doing? Okay, what can I do? Like it is.
This isn't even my final form.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Or another Richard Garfield game, Netrunner, which is incredibly asymmetric. Like the two factions have...
Pour one out.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And that manages to, again, create these two very different types of conflicts, where one player kind of sets the tone and the other player just breaks it down. As in Netrunner, one player plays a corporation, and the other player plays a hacker trying to basically ruin their day, while the corp is attempting to accomplish objectives, playing cards out of their deck that are the victory points for the other player. And it's crazy. Highly recommend if you can get it these days.
Yep.
Oh, I hear it's on discount.
Yeah. Let's see. Should we shift to our next topic? All right. So let's see. We've kind of gone through these. All right. So let's talk about the designing, the process of developing our 1v many games and sort of what went into them. We can kind of go We'll just go down the row. So, Tim, do you want to start talking about how you started designing and what you experienced with games like Sabotage or Fugitive? Or
Yeah, for
pick
those
one, and then we'll
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
each
It
do
just,
one, and then
I
we'll do again.
mean, Sabotage was actually just fans were like, "What happened after Burgle Bros? Did they get away?" Like, and it was literally this like kind of narrative lark where it's like, I want like a chase scene or something, and that just kind of percolated in my head for a while, and then I was on my way to PAX South in the middle, one of those Doc Brown moments where I just like woke up and I'm like, I know what this is, and I couldn't stop talking to my friends about it, and they're like, sure, you're great, But it from the very beginning, it was this chase, and like, how would I do chase with some really basic numbers, and it was, I think at the best the best type of design for me is when I'm trying to go for an emotion. And I wanted the Terminator. I want just like one person is powerless to fight the other person. You're just running and you keep running, and you hope they don't catch you. And there's that's the whole tension. And so I came from an emotional side when I was designing, and in creating early on the fine lines. Like there's no overlap between these abilities and these abilities. Never the twain shall meet. There's no, and so. Deciding that early, I think, deciding like what are your borders. In Sabotage, we're like, okay, the guard can never hit in his own square, so the safest place for the spy to be is in the same square, and we just stick to those rules, and then the other systems end up being constrained around that. And I think picking your signposts for that.
Cool.
Yeah,
talk about some vasts or some roots.
Yeah. So for me, so my role in making these games is to, rather than designing the game, is to make sure that the asymmetry actually works, is actually understandable, and the players can actually play it without ripping their hair out. And so coming from Vast, so I worked on Vast, the Crystal Caverns, which is Leader Games' first asymmetric game. And so when I came onto that project and worked on that project, my takeaways from that project, it's an incredibly asymmetric game that is very interesting. But what I was seeing...
Do you want to give a rundown of what Vast is for those
absolutely.
who don't know the...
So Vast is an asymmetric dungeon crawl game where a hero is going into a cave to slay a dragon. And meanwhile, there are goblins in the cave trying to surround and kill the hero before she can kill the goblin. And then one player is actually playing the cave itself, and you're trying to keep everybody in check long enough until you collapse on everybody and everybody dies. So it's this incredibly asymmetric game with lots of really interesting interactions going on. But what was happening in that game, upon release, lots of people were starting to play it. What was happening in that game was so much of the game was getting caught up in re-referencing rules that for the first couple plays, it's just really, really hard to get your head around everything at once. And so coming from that experience, I wanted to see whether in Root, so the thing that really stuck in my head was it was either Chris Cieslik or Carl Chudik from Asymmetric Games did a little mini review, and he basically said, the rulebook is basically 5 player aids kind of glued together. And I was like, that's totally fair. Like, that is absolutely what happened. So coming into Root, I wanted to figure out a way where we could get players playing within like 5 to 10 minutes and really never have to reference a big player aid that has all of their rules on it.
You saved a lot on glue.
Yeah, we saved a lot on glue. And so in Root, what I wanted to do was basically see if I could integrate everything the player needed to know into very succinct phrases on their player board that's going to be sitting in front of them the entire time. And basically this process was creating a prototype, putting it in front of people, explaining the absolute barest minimum about the game, and then saying, okay, look at your player board. Tell me what you don't understand. Without explaining any other rules. And so it was this process of kind of I wanted to figure out the way to get to where players were intuiting, not 100% correct, because that's basically impossible, but like as close to correct as possible most of the time. Because the main problem is in Vast is that sunk cost of trying to learn, and so in working with Root, we wanted to do as much as possible to just make it a plunk it down, look at it, and be able to intuit as much as possible. So that was the major drive for me as I was working on Root.
Cool.
So the first game that I think most people consider asymmetric that I worked on would be XCOM. And there's actually kind of two different forms of asymmetry in XCOM, both of which are significantly less complex than something like Vast. One of them is asymmetry of the mechanics of each individual role within the team. So XCOM is a co-op game where all 4 players are working together to fend off an alien threat to the world, to the Earth. But we have like the communications officer and the commander and the scientist, the squad leader. So they're all trying to do these different things, but they need to work together in order to overcome the alien threat. And the main mechanics of the game are the same for everyone. You have the same dice rolling mechanism that leads to success or failure. You have the same threat mechanism that can cause you to lose units. But the types of units that each of them has acts differently and does different things and interacts with the aliens in a different way. And they're all trying to accomplish a specific goal. So like the scientist is trying to research these different techs to help upgrade the team. The commander is trying to shoot down alien UFOs in orbit. The communications officer is actually interacting with the game itself, the kind of the AI structure that runs the game. And communicating that information to the rest of the players so everyone knows what's going on. And then the squad leader is essentially kind of the glory figure of the playable roles, because what they're focusing on is missions that actually lead to the victory condition of the game, whereas everyone else is trying to just stop you from losing. And then the other type of asymmetry in it is actually similar to the one versus many. However, in this case, XCOM is an app game. So the digital component is controlling the aliens, it's telling you where the UFOs are showing up, what the aliens are doing, and it controls their strategy. And that entire AI structure that exists that shows their strategy and what they're trying to do, all of that was designed by me. So in a way, I'm the one versus many. So anytime you play XCOM, you can blame me if I destroy you with aliens.
And I mean, that almost became more pronounced when you worked on Mansions of Madness.
Absolutely.
Where you took a one versus many game and turned it into a cooperative game by replacing that one player with an AI app. Do you want to talk about that experience?
Sure. So what John is talking about, Mansions of Madness, is a game where you are investigators. This is also in the Lovecraftian universe. All of my games seem to be. So you generally are going into a mansion, not all the time, to solve some kind of a mystery. There's probably tentacles involved. In the original Mansions of Madness, it was a one versus many type of a situation. So you had up to 4 players, and then you had one keeper player, who is like the overlord in Descent, or the Imperial player in Imperial Assault. However, Mansions of Madness it didn't want the keeper player to really try to win the game. It really wanted that player to act more like a GM in an RPG, to just facilitate a good play experience for the players. But that's not how people tended to play the game, which resulted in the keeper being able to just usually destroy everything all the time. So in second edition, which was designed by me, we took the idea of what is that keeper player and what are the cooperative team, and how do we make it so that everyone gets to have a cool, fun, more balanced experience all the time. So yet again, we take what was a player role, the keeper, and we move that into a digital component with the app. There could just be a whole other panel about apps.
There really should be.
So again, all of those AI structures that determine what the keeper player is doing and how they do it, that was all designed by me again, and it's essentially I am the keeper player against everyone else. But then Mansions, of course, still has the ever so slight asymmetry of the player roles of different characters have different abilities, but most people don't even consider that to
And
be
some players may be
asymmetry.
traitors.
That's also true. You might go insane, and you might suddenly want to just burn the house down. So that's also another
happens.
level of asymmetry. There's a lot of little different pieces of asymmetry that can exist in games.
Yeah, and hey, the success of Mansions of Madness, that aspect of Mansions of Madness, soon led to Imperial Assault and Descent getting their own AI Overlord type apps. But so when I was working on Imperial Assault, that was a long way off. So we actually had to work on a similar problem of the Overlord or the Imperial player. Really, just your objective is to kill the players. Your objective is to kick them down. And so that meant that a lot of the optimal strategies are strategies that are not super fun for the other players to interact with. Particularly in Descent 2nd Edition, it was a big problem where the Overlord player is very heavily incentivized when facing a team of 4 players to find the weakest member of that team and just hammer them into the ground. Just like grind them down and make sure that they can't do anything. Because basically you've then reduced the enemy team's effectiveness by a full quarter. And that is one of the best strategies they can do. And that feels super unfun for that player to be like, all right, I've gotten up, I do an attack, and then they just get dogpiled again. In Imperial Assault, we wanted to focus on addressing that by making it so that each hero had kind of a wound threshold, where like once you get them down a certain amount, they're wounded, and they're slightly weaker overall, but they're still completely in the game. And then your goal isn't to kill all the players, it's to wound all the players, and then they retreat, or all the heroes, and then they retreat. And so that meant that once you took someone down to that level, you're really incentivized to move on to other characters. And so while you still could target one and even take them out completely, Imperial Assault actually has player elimination. But because that is often wasting time you could spend wounding another hero who is progressing, you don't. So we had to adjust all of our incentive systems to make sure that the play experience, playing well, also meant playing in a way that was most exciting for the people you were playing against. And on kind of a more pleasant note on the hero side, we knew each of the heroes had unique characters, but we found that in a lot of games, as you would progress, like, okay, everyone comes, everyone's kind of participating, and it's fine. It was structured kind of like an RPG. And we kind of set it up so that at the start of the game, when you pick a hero, you also shuffle a special mission in that is unique to your hero, that would basically give your hero a day in the limelight session, where it's like, oh, this mission is actually about Jinodan the Smuggler going after a vendetta for someone who she personally really hates. And we were at first concerned that this kind of asymmetry of narrative value, right? Like, this player is now the most important character for this mission, and if they are defeated, that's the end of the mission, right? We were worried that would actually be kind of a negative experience that would make someone be, most important character. But it actually, because this could go around and everyone had the chance to do it, and everyone, in board games, we're all very good friends, that actually led to much more exciting stories and much more long-term player investment. Because it's like, oh, the Jedi did her mission and got her lightsaber. Well, now she's like, all right, well, I got my thing. We should do Jin's thing to let her get her revenge, or and it really helped push the game forward and helped create a much deeper sense of player engagement in the system.
In this vein, too, I wanted to go back a little bit to the app thing. What I looking at it at a larger scope, looking at how computer games, video games have influenced board games, because in the 80s, there was kind of this. Video games really came onto the scene, and board games kind of retreated. But then in the 90s, it was like, oh, board games can still be fun. And I think that
I don't know about that.
Well, but there's just this overlap that basically, if you think about, we play a video game and we're like, oh, it's cool to kill a lot of zombies, and then we're like, well, can we do that in a board game? And it's like, oh, well, we can create the system that can generate zombies. And then they're like, well, maybe we can have a player be that. And basically being able to swap around and say, okay, like even in Sabotage, we're like, oh, because there's this limited communication, we can make an app for the guards that you can play against if you just want to play 2 people against that. And then there's solo play. There's game mechanics that can support solo play now. And I think there is just really ripe right now for both game systems to take over players, apps to take over players, players to take over roles that are traditionally done by a computer or a system. And it's such a rich design space. I'm saying they all overlap because we're now kind of breaking all the rules with expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the point about how you prevent people from crushing other players into dust in asymmetric games is an interesting one because it really depends upon the specific type of asymmetric gaming that you're making. You know, if it's a one versus many, like Imperial Assault or Mansions of Madness, or free for all like Root, or 1v1 like Fugitive, it takes on really different forms. So like in Root. Shut Up and Sit Down has described Root as an ecosystem, and that really holds true in this case because what you'll find in Root, the thing that is incentivizing players to not just like focus on one person, like short of vindictiveness, which we can't really control for, but what's controlling people from not doing that is because if you went out into an ecosystem and you killed all of the birds, that's going to have major downstream effects. Like that's going to upset everything. And so once you've played a couple times, you realize like, oh yeah, I actually can't drive a player too hard into the ground because that means that there won't be an effective check on other people's later in the game. And so you're basically hurting yourself by hurting another player too much. And
If
so
you bully the cats too much, now we're just swimming in mice.
Exactly. So if you disturb one part of the ecosystem, yeah, exactly. You disturb one part of the ecosystem and everything else just blows up.
Very
So-
Darwinian.
That said, please tell me, how do I crush the vagabond into dust?
Oh, that's a funny one. I mean, vagabonds, your classic prisoner's dilemma. The vagabonds, there's a few things about the vagabond. So we really give you a nice incentive to do nice things for the vagabond by crafting items for him. So the vagabond is the
Witcher.
is this little wily raccoon who's bopping around the forest and basically becoming everyone's best friend or worst enemy. Basically, he scores points by either helping people by like giving them cards or by killing their stuff. He can also do some quests for the woodland people, but those are the two ways that he's interacting with the other players. And what a lot of times when people are first starting to play Roots, it's often either the Woodland Alliance, who's your sort of rebel alliance faction, or the Vagabond that wins on that first play, because it's harder to see the strategies that can effectively suppress them. And we even incentivize you to help the Vagabond by giving you victory points for doing so. So it's not so much crushing the Vagabond into dust that's an effective strategy, although it can be if you have enough forces. It's understanding when to suppress your own desire to get ahead. Understanding at what points in time in the game, it's like, okay, if I craft this thing for the Vagabond right now, that's going to set into motion this chain of events. Like if I craft this sword for the Vagabond, that means that like if the Vagabond is incentivized to go for me at that point, I am really screwing myself over at that point in time. So understanding the dynamic of the game in that way and understanding what you are giving to the Vagabond at any given point in the game, that's sort of the root, no pun intended, that's sort of the root.
Get out.
That's sort of the root of countering the Vagabond, is understanding that what the Vagabond is incentivized to do, whether he's incentivized to go against you or whether he's incentivized to go against other players at particular moments, and how to interact with that, how to help him at various moments.
To the balance factor here, not crushing other players. Actually, I mean, Fugitive had this problem where sometimes you just get way ahead, and I don't really like to do kind of these artificial, blue.
There's a seaplane going over us right now.
Man, it's like the blue shell in Mario, right? That whole like catch-up mechanic that feels really arbitrary. I didn't really want to do that, but I went ahead and did it. I was like, "This is
Hail Mary."
Yeah,
at the end
it's
of the game.
It's the manhunt.
Yeah.
And what it can take is even though it can feel artificial, and maybe just as a designer, I see it as this artificial thing, it can take a blowout game and make it into this really like dramatic ending where it's just like, okay, if you can pick all these numbers, you still have a shot at winning.
So for those who don't know, in Fugitive, where you're pursuing a criminal, if they're way out ahead and they basically make it to their final objective and you're super far behind, you have one, as the marshal, you have one final shot to basically answer every location they've been to correctly.
Yeah.
And if you can pull that off, you win anyway.
Yeah.
And it is so hard, but it is so tense.
Yeah, and when you pull it off,
you feel like...
Yeah, it's just like don't tell me the odds, and you just you go for it.
That's great. Yeah, that's good. All right. I think now is probably a good time that we can we can open up for questions. We got microphones in the back. If anyone has any particular questions about games we've worked on, what have you, we'll try and gauge the length of our responses based on the number of questions we get. Let's start over here.
I've noticed there's a lot of asymmetric games where a lot of effort's gone into balancing all the different pieces. So, like, regardless of which faction you pick or whatever, you're on even footing relatively. But actually, one of the things I really enjoy about Root is that some of the factions seem much less powerful, and I actually really enjoy that because I'm usually teaching the game to people, and like nobody wants to play Scythe with me because I just crush them because I've played it a gazillion times and it's like their first time. So how do you balance for player skill, or is that something you consider?
That is a big one. So, does one of you guys want to kick off on this one, or?
Well, I'll just say a little bit about Root. And so Cole, the designer, and I, he really, really wanted to do exactly what you were saying. Fundamental philosophy of Root is that it's a game about making interesting stories. It's not like primarily designed to be a hyper-competitive game. And so, as I said before, you'll notice in earlier games, certain factions will have different win rates than others. And over time, that evens out a bit, but some factions are designed purposefully to be a little bit weaker. One reason for that is so that an experienced player can come into the game and still play without having to quarterback everyone else. So the Lizards, which is an expansion faction, is kind of the most extreme example of this. They have very non-intuitive strategies, and they require you to be highly political in order to win the day. And so having that mixture of certain factions that have more intuitive strategies, certain factions that have less intuitive strategies, you can stick the completely new player on the Cats who are playing this sort of pretty straightforward engine building and supply line game, and you can have the Lizards over in the corner doing this absolutely wild thing that even though the new player doesn't know some of those weird strategies that the Lizards are doing, the Lizard player probably also doesn't really know yet, and so it allows for these interesting narratives to develop, whereas different players at different skill levels can still be at relatively the same point in figuring out, like, if you think about like how much of a faction you understand, you can have a new player at understanding 50% of their faction. You can have a more experienced player understanding about 50% of their faction.
Yeah,
so.
I think that's definitely a strong point. Essentially, you can totally gauge for complexity, and you can design fundamental handicaps as you describe. I think a lot of games do it. Not every game does it, and not every game needs to, but like, it's totally a valid thing for designers, and we could probably talk about that for another 2 hours, but we got more questions. Let's go over here.
So balance looks hard.
You're not wrong.
You have games like Blood Bowl that have been very asymmetrical and balanced over 30-something years, and still people have a lot of chats on that. You will have games like Rebellion, Star Wars Rebellion, favorite of mine, where you have people watching very closely the effect of whichever change you have. So 2 questions really. First, what are the tools you look at for balancing, going forward? Do you think, so win percentages or those kind of things? And kind of 1A question, does it really matter? Is this something, a lot of people obsess over that, but do you?
There's such a thing as too much of either end, right? Like, if the game is completely unbalanced, no one's going to play it. And if the game is too perfectly balanced, why is it asymmetrical at all, right? Like, you might as well, yeah. But yeah, playtesting, right?
Yeah, I have a friend over at Blizzard, and they kind of have this problem where they over polish, and they've actually internally tried to, like, it's kind of fun to have some inconsistency in a game or some warts in the game that almost give it personality. It can drive different narratives. Not that you shouldn't try, but I think that it can be a spice. It can make something feel distinct.
Yeah, the Vagabond in Root is really that faction. We often describe him as the wedge faction. Some people love him, some people hate him, and that really depends upon your own play style. The Vagabond creates these really weird and uneasy alliances between players, in ways that form interesting narratives, but he is designed very, very differently from the other core factions.
Yeah. You can't please everyone, but the more different things you have, the more people you can please in small cases.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's go over here.
Yeah, I showed up a little late, so if you already discussed this, just let me know, and
Yep.
I'll just shuffle away.
We'll all just boo you right
Yeah,
here from
exactly.
the stage. Yeah, no.
So I have a question. In the context of one versus many games, a lot of people subscribe to an idea where the one should be more of a GM role and kind of pull their punches in order to ensure that the many are having more fun, as opposed to like lots of people being beat down. I was wondering if you could discuss that.
So there are different schools of thought, right? Like, I mean, I am personally of the opinion that I will, like, going as hard as you can and being, you know, there to destroy each other. Sometimes that's what you come to the table for. This is kind of a social contract thing, right? Like, and that's not always fun for everyone. Even in games that are like Cosmic Encounter or whatever, I might pull my punches just because it'll make a more interesting game. Patrick Rothfuss and James Ernest wrote a book to go with their game TAC, which has a whole section on the idea, on the philosophy of playing a beautiful game, right? Where it's like, you don't want to just destroy them outright. You want to like show them how much better than them you are. And sometimes that can be like walking into their trap just to like show you that you can dismantle it. And if you can't, well, that's on you. And, you know, the game is more fun when players are playing in that way. But if players also come to the table and want to do true test of skill stuff, then yeah, absolutely don't hold back. But that's a conversation that should happen with the players, and that they should, you know, be comfortable with, right? Like, because no one wants to feel like I've come to play in earnest, and if you're holding back, that can feel bad. But you know, different skill levels exist, and that just has to be acknowledged. Like, and players will play around that.
It also depends a lot on which game it is and what the designer's intent for it was. So like what I was talking about with Mansion's first edition, it was designed with the intent that the keeper would be pulling their punches, whereas something like Descent was designed with the intention that the Overlord would be trying their hardest to overcome what the heroes are throwing at them. So definitely a discussion with your group, but also just kind of gauging what the game is that you're playing.
In Doom in particular, we actually designed it so that the Overlord has it's much more challenging for the Overlord than other games in that genre, than the other Descent kind of line of games. Primarily to see, like, the Overlord has a more complicated set of skills, and it's just a really challenging game for them. And some players really like that because it means they can go all out, but some players who were less experienced felt just steamrolled by the heroes and like, oh, how is it even possible to win? And that was, you know, had its own whole things. We should move on.
One quick thing is the cat string theory. 'Cause sometimes your goal is to, you know, get them interested in playing more of this game. And, you know, in the immortal words, let the Wookiee win.
Oh, we got a mic going.
Hello?
There we go.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, there are some games where they are basically fully symmetric, and then suddenly one player becomes the other player. So it becomes asymmetric, like in Mansions of Madness that does this. But this means that the previous investment of this player becomes moot. So how do you solve this?
I feel like, I mean, part of that is just the magic circle. Like, a lot of it is just agreeing that that's something that's going to happen.
I mean, so yeah, like, I think games like The Thing or Battlestar Galactica, where like halfway through you're playing as a normal human, and then you get a card, it's like, oh, now you're on the other team. Good luck with that, which is, you know, that is part of the appeal of those games, honestly, that paranoia, that tension. And really, you do need to kind of build your game for that.
Yeah, so two really good examples of this. One is Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition, which, for anyone that doesn't know, there's a insanity mechanic in it. If you take enough horror in the game, you will go insane, and then you get another card that kind of changes what your win condition is. In a lot of cases, you'll still be part of the co-op team, but in some cases, you won't be anymore. You'll betray them in some capacity. Another great example of this is Betrayal in the House on the Hill. And in both of those games, you kind of have to go into them knowing that, for the most part, this is a co-op game, but you want to understand that at any given moment, someone might suddenly betray the rest of the group, and like that's part of that game. That's part of the story that's being told. With betrayal, it's the entire story. It's called betrayal.
This is exactly what it says on the tin.
Yeah.
It's a betrayal
Spoiler
in a
alert.
house that's on a hill.
Yeah. So
Or a
with
table.
Mansions, I definitely leaned a lot. Betrayal is one of the first hobby games that I ever played and really enjoyed. So that's definitely an inspiration for the insanity mechanic in Mansions. But certainly there's plenty of people who go into Mansions and they remove those betrayer insanities from the pool ahead of time so that they can have that full co-op experience.
All right. Next.
Hey, I just wanted to say, first off, I'm incredibly addicted to all of your games, so thanks for all the wonderful evenings we've had.
Thank you for all of your money.
You got that. I just wanted to ask, a lot of the games that y'all are talking about feature scaling for different numbers of players and indeed different game types. So for Imperial Assault, there's the campaign mode or the skirmish version. For Vast, there are different variants based on the number of players
Lots
you
of
play
things.
with. Lots of different. So I don't know if this is maybe applicable to everyone, but do you feel like designing for different game modes dilutes a stronger single experience?
That is a big topic. It is hard, honestly, designing for different numbers of players because playing a game with just one other person is such a different experience from playing with like 5 other people, right? And ideally, we just want as many people to be able to enjoy the game as possible. A lot of games with more restrictive player counts are just really unplayable in a lot of groups where it's like, oh, we have 3 people, so we can't play Witness. Or it's like, okay, we're going to get 4 people in for Witness, but someone, brought their good friend who, is in town for the day. It's like, well, we can't play Witness anymore because it's a 4-player game. And so a lot of those player count adjustments are in favor of that setup, or, in favor of making things easier for players, with the caveat that it's much harder for the designers because you basically exponentially increase the amount of testing that you need. Like, I'm fully willing to say the 2-hero legendary version for Imperial Assault is not great because we sort of set it up mathematically. It was supposedly okay, but there are a couple of missions where it's like much harder for the 2 players, or several missions where it's way easier because the heroes have better action economy. And it's just a factor of testing, and oftentimes just there's not enough time in the world to test enough.
Yeah, I think this is another place where expectations is really important. So in the rulebook, we actually talk about each faction mixture that you can have in the base game and a bit in the expansion. And we give you, like, okay, here are recommended, like, if you're playing for, like, the first time, like, at different player counts, here's what we recommend. And for the other ones, we give you an idea of, okay, even though this isn't one we recommend, we're going to give you kind of the lowdown on what this experience is going to feel like a little bit.
And if you're into that.
Yeah, and if you're into that experience, just go in knowing that this is the experience that you're going to have. So as long as the players don't feel blindsided and you give them that information, then that goes a long way.
That's a great point. Let's we got 5 minutes left. Let's get these done. Oh,
Hello?
switching gear. Yep.
Okay. First off, I love all y'all's games. But my question is, a lot of cooperative games in particular implement asymmetry in order to try and prevent a single player from quarterbacking. But in a lot of cases, that asymmetry just comes out to be player secrets, just so that a quarterback isn't working with perfect information. Do you guys have any thoughts on other ways to implement asymmetry to sort of allow every player a time in the limelight? Jonathan, I know you were talking about the narrative cards, but just any thoughts you had on that?
Preventing quarterbacking is the lifelong mission of many designers. I've backed off of it, and that's a huge conversation. But the quick answer, I've used timers, and then also information horizons. So in Burgle, like, you don't know whether it's better to run or peek into this next room. So you as the player are just going to have to make the call. So
I like timers personally. That's my favorite one because it's like you don't have time to explain to them exactly what they need to do. Just go. There's a lot of ways.
From a development standpoint, distributing responsibilities is really important. So in Root, we made sure that every individual player had their own setup instructions. We made sure that every individual player had a little bit of information about all of the other factions by giving them little overview cards. So creating an atmosphere where you distribute the information and you distribute the responsibility of doing things is another way, like in development, where you can encourage people not to quarterback.
Awesome. You want anything else, or should we move on?
I tend to not do much at all in the way of preventing quarterbacking. I tend to just hope that you're playing with a group of people that everyone is kind of getting along and wanting to work together. But if you are playing with someone who is doing that, I hope that it's a conversation that you can have with them to maybe ask them to stop doing that. But I realize that's not really an option for everyone, so I don't have the best answer here.
It's a similar conversation to don't play with bullies who are going to focus one player. Don't play with someone who wants to dominate the whole game. You know? Anyway.
Hello? Hi. So you mentioned the social contract, the magic circle, and the feelings and emotions designers want the players to feel. Why isn't that information conveyed to the buyer at the point of purchase? Why do I need a psychology degree and hours of research to avoid gambling on my precious relationships with friends?
We have a lot of limited rulebook space, and also back-of-the-box text. That doesn't tend to be something very exciting. Generally, these are social games. We kind of perhaps presume too much that players will understand how to play well socially and how to play with each other. And it's just not a conversation that's super easy to approach for everyone.
I use movies. People understand the emotion they feel when they, Ocean's 11 or the movie The Fugitive. Like, they if you can give them a lattice work of it's going to feel like this thing and you can deliver on that, then that can help them make that choice. What? Yeah. Like what can you refer?
Touchstone.
Yeah, what can you refer to in that they already know? And I try to do that for so.
In terms of that information not being presented up front, like in the marketing, I'll also say there's just so many people that are working on games, and not everyone has the same perspective and the same knowledge of the game. And for at least the four of us, there's probably very little input that any of us have into the marketing of something, or what even goes on the back of a box, or how it's talked about in media that much. So it might just be something that whoever is doing that portion of getting that game out there doesn't know what information to convey.
And some games do. Like I mentioned, TAC, right, has that book that's all about that whole thing, which is great. Let's go.
Hey, turned on right away.
Great.
You already talked a little bit about cosmic self-balancing with multiple different asymmetric sides, and I can kind of expect that a two-sided asymmetry can be almost trivial to balance. Do you find that there's a certain number of sides that is the hardest to design for?
I don't know, Tim. Is it trivial to balance?
It's 1v1. I don't know. Yeah, 1v1 is often the hardest to balance, just because like every single thing you give to one side or the other could be an advantage or a disadvantage, and those advantages could be exploited.
The group dynamics you talked about, right? People, the gang up on whoever's ahead mechanic. Groups self-regulate, surprisingly. That it's like, okay, he's being the bully. Hey, you want to go in? Let's go after him, and that happens.
I find 3 the hardest, actually, to give a hard player number. 3 is almost a perfect balance of power, where if anyone pursues, like, if I target that player, I am now open to lose to that player and giving the game to them. And so everyone tends to just be very defensive and turtle in a lot of those kind of games. I don't like playing strategy games at 3 for that reason, because they tend to be very slow and very punishing.
Well, zero-sum, almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Some games that do this really well are games where one of the sides is kind of limited in the ways that they can interact with the other two. So Maria is a game, it's a historical war game, where it is a 3-sided game and it's quite asymmetric, but there are literally 2 parts of the map, and one of the sides is restricted in how it can actually get into different parts of the map. And so creating those asymmetries and how that third faction can actually interact with the other two is one way to sort of break that balance problem with 3.
So I think like 4 and 5, you tend to get alliances and stuff, which is what makes those things interesting. But yeah.
Yeah, I tend to notice that with, especially in free-for-all games, 3 players, whichever player decides not to engage first is the one that will eventually have the advantage. But there's definitely ways to design around that. For instance, I would love to play a 3-player game of Root with the cats and the birds, and then the third player being the otters. Just to see
The
how the
power
otters
brokers.
can like be like, oh, I will sell both of you all of these lovely things. Come help. You can destroy each other, and I shall not benefit from this at all.
That's great.
Exactly. Yeah. Power broker factions and the alliances are classic with 3, and the alliance because
We are at time, so
okay.
give a good wrap up. Are you good?
We
can talk about Root all day.
We can
later
talk about
on.
it.
Come
Anyway,
talk to us.
thank you all so much for coming. We're super happy to have you and to yammer about our games. Hopefully that was good.